Right, that's better. Okay, so we use lots and lots and lots of this polygonal lasso selection tool and the normal lasso selection tool. And the idea is that you make a selection tool of the shape that you're going to want to paint, and then you use a couple of big old brushes to sort of define the form and the value of it. And you use big brushes that are textured to give you, so that the texture gives you some of the texture in the rock for free, and it stops you from having too small a brush like this and trying to sketch out every single last detail of the rock. So if you use bigger brushes, just as a recap, then you'll find your life a lot easier. Also, by doing the form, by making this a value study of these kind of rocks and boulders, you can easily apply an overlay. For example, an overlay layer, maybe a clipping layer, that will allow you to sort of do a wash of colour, and it won't affect the values you've already done. I'll stop nattering and actually do it so you can actually see what's going on. So if I started to think about making this kind of rock, this kind of cliff shape just here, so I'm going to do it a bit out of context. When you do it, I want you to do it in context, have a go at doing the whole kind of structure. But I go to the polygonal lasso selection tool, and first things first, sort of roughly define the shape of the entire rock face. Okay, both shadow and lit section. I'm using the polygonal lasso at the moment. You could use the freehand lasso as well if you wanted to. They will give you slightly different effects. I think I quite like this polygonal one just for the initial sort of blocking, so to speak. So that's going to be my rough shape, right? I want to switch to a brush. I want to switch to my current favourite brush anyway, which is here. Actually, it's my second favourite brush. First things first is to fill this shape with kind of like the average, neutral kind of value. So it's quite a bright kind of rock, so I'm going to go for a lightish kind of grey, above mid kind of value. Make sure I'm zoomed out a bit, because again, I don't want to be too close zoomed in, because I don't want to be tempted to try and draw details. So with a big brush and the kind of neutral kind of tone, I'm just going to hide my selection and just sketch out, just fill in that kind of rock shape. Like this, and I hid my selection like that. That's going to be the sort of the overall neutral kind of tone for the rock face. Next thing I want to do, and I'm doing this super quick, obviously if you do it slower, you'll do a better job, is now to sort of define the lit side, split up the lit side from the shadow kind of side. So I'll tackle the shadow side first. So again, I'm using the polygonal lasso selection, and now I'm going to sort of trace out that kind of shadowed, that initial kind of core shadow kind of area. But in general, I'm just going to sort of split up some shadow kind of area like that. I'm not going to be too attempt to be too massively precise to that reference. That reference is that's all it actually is. It's reference. It's not something that I want to direct copy from. Just to give me an idea. So this is going to be the shadowed side. Same process. Back to my nice large brush, and now select a darker kind of value. By the way, you will probably want to have, if your brushes don't already support it, you probably want to have your opacity, pressure sensitivity on for this. So I'm going to choose a darker value for the shadow, and hopefully you can remember me mentioning that if you have bigger brushes and you make more considered brush strokes, so one, two kind of brush strokes, but you also, your paintings will benefit from the fact that if you follow the form of the thing that you're trying to paint as well. So with this brush, I'm going to paint some shadows in. I've got my selection hidden, but there it is. And I'm going to sort of sweep it around like this. So sort of want to suggest that kind of sloping kind of pattern like that. So do that, and then if you notice, you tend to get darker kind of areas where the core shadow kind of is. So if I brush a little bit more over that kind of area, it'll darken up like that. Now I want to switch to my other brush to add some more texture. And this is my other second favourite brush at the moment, this kind of oil brush. I'm going to make this big old brush like this, and again I'm going to choose a slightly darker value. My selection's still there, and I'm going to just sort of make these quick movements with the brush, and I'm going to delete. I'm going to Control Z. I'm going to undo if I don't like it. Now, because this brush is nice and textured, it's going to give you these kind of little streak marks here that will begin to sort of imply some of the rock kind of details. And again, if I don't like the brush stroke, I'm instantly undoing it. Something like that, maybe. Now I sort of want to do the opposite. I want to work on the lit side. So again, I'm deselecting. Every time I do this, I'm deselecting my selections and reselecting them because I want them to all overlap. That's going to add to the sort of organic, more realistic feel. I'm going to switch to the freehand lasso this time to make a selection of the lit area because this will give me a rougher, sort of more gnarly kind of edge kind of going on. Do something like that. Maybe actually I'm going to add a little bit just here where I missed off. Yeah, back to my brush and back to that big old brush like that. This time I'm going to add some brighter kind of highlights to this neutral kind of tone. So I'm going to select that, alt click it, go up here, choose a lighter kind of value and sort of suggest some highlights going on. And again, notice because I was loose with my selection, I'm going over my selections. You're beginning to build up these kind of lines upon lines. When this builds up with different textured brushes, let me switch to it so I can pinpoint it a bit better. This is what I'm talking about. This kind of stuff here. As you go over this, as you retrace selections and you use nice large textured brushes, this line, this edge here, will begin to break up further and further. It'll still be predominantly crisp, but it'll start to take on some of the texture of the brushes that you're using, which will give your picture, your painting, a more kind of painterly look the more you work at it that kind of way. So I'm going to go for a lighter value and kind of brush in some highlights kind of going on just here. Again, maybe beginning to sort of define planes of the rock face by painting in the direction that I think the rock face would be. And I'd go back to my other brush, sort of contrasting textured kind of brush, and maybe even with a brighter one. Let's see what it looks like with brighter. Well, maybe a bit darker. Just want that kind of stuff to happen to gradually build up. So I work a little bit on the lit side. Now I can go back to the shadowed side. Again, this time with a freehand lasso selection. This time I'm going to try and start to define some of these actual cracks and kind of things like that. So, well, just the darker areas. Again, I don't want to think of it, and you shouldn't be thinking of this when you're trying to work from reference or you're trying to work on any painting. Try not to think of the subject. Try and think of the shapes. So it shouldn't really matter to you whether it's a crack, whether it's a shadow, whether it's a bit of a boulder sticking up. Instead, you're looking for the shapes. So I'm going to draw a kind of little streaky line like going like this. Like that. That'll be one. Again, I'm going to use this as reference, as a jumping off point, not to literally try and copy every last bit of it, because that would be kind of tedious to do anyway. So I just want to get some of these darker areas kind of going on just here. This. Something like that. Back to that original brush. I can select this. Now I can go quite a bit darker because these are going to be much more kind of darker shadowed kind of areas. But I'm just going to bring that in like that. Again, try and follow the form of whatever it is you're trying to paint. So again, I'm going to keep that. Actually, I'm going to do this on a clipping layer. So this will stop me from painting. Actually, no. What am I going to do? Let me think. I'm going to draw another selection out. Like this. Back to that larger kind of textured kind of brush. And let's just make some stuff like that. So gradually you're building up that texture. And again, I'm trying to follow some of the actual form of the rock with my brush strokes. Now you notice there's quite a lot of what they call bounce light going on here. So it gets darker and it's shadowed, but the sunlight's hitting this really bright rock and bouncing a lot of light back onto the underside of this. So if you can simulate that, that's often something that will elevate your stuff from being workmanlike to a little bit more refined, you know? So if you can, you've gone darker, you've implied shadow, but now you actually want to sort of begin to go a little bit lighter again. I might actually shrink my brush down a little bit for this one, just to sort of curve around here. To suggest some light bouncing back up onto here. Okay, so I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to go back again to the top. I'm going to want to define, there's a bit more sort of light and shade going on even on these lit areas. So I'm going to, again, reselect that area up here. Like this. I'll just leave it that as a nice loose sort of sloppy selection. There we go. Just Control H to hide it. Now I want to just define a little bit more light and shadow here. So there's like a sideways sort of vertical plane of rock here compared to this kind of sloping bit here. So this is a bit darker, and I'm going to represent this bit just here in that. So I'm going to select that value and darken it a bit. Again, fairly big brush. Just begin to darken that up a little bit like this. Maybe add a bit more into just here and to just here. Now you can add in just these sort of, again on the top side, on the lit side, you can suggest these little micro cracks and things like that. Just make little wiggly kind of little freehand shapes on the lit side of your rock. Again, thinking of big, medium and small, so don't put all these little nooks and crannies all over the place. Cluster them together and then break them apart. Hide that again. This time I want to go, let's just, actually that same value should work. There we go, yeah. So then we begin to add in some of this stuff at the top. So you see how you can build up, you can simplify and build up a rocky kind of texture and form just using the selection tools. Now, just to show you what I mean about building up the form of it using nothing but grayscale, and then potentially wanting to add the equivalent of a wash to work on the color of this. So that's your layer there. That's where your sort of your value study of that rock is. Put another layer on top. Make a clipping mask and change this to something like overlay or soft light or color. You don't need to sign for that, Michael. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Now you can choose, this is an overlay now. Now you can choose this kind of color and freely, with no cares in the world, just begin to sort of paint over the top, and it will only go over what you've already done. Now you can go darker or red for the shadowed kind of areas. this, and maybe kind of slightly different colours. You want to mix up. You don't want always the same colour, by the way. Now, this is what's called a wash, okay? Which hopefully most of you are familiar with the concept of that. So in Photoshop, you can do a wash using this sort of overlay on a clipping mask. You shouldn't think of this though as that's how you do all of your colour stuff. It's a wash. It's something to get you started with. Ideally, once you get to a certain point with this kind of wash, you collapse it all, and now you're not paying an overlay. Now you're not painting an overlay, I should say. Sorry, you're directly sampling probably from the colours you've got here, maybe saturating them up a little bit or changing the value of them, and doing further kind of colour work on top of it. So anyway, that was the general gist of building up in just fairly easy sort of steps this kind of shape of this rock. I think it's very important that you learn how to get some reference and to simplify the reference using the largest possible brush strokes that you can, and yet still get the feeling of all this gnarly rock texture kind of going on, where you never really went that small. You never had to paint it individually. You were letting all these lasso selections do the kind of hard work for you. So I'll just stop that now, that recording. So if you go